It's terrible that after 50 years it is behind closed doors, and I've no intention. Now I started to stop now. I'm determined to put an end to this. Terrible.
If the Privy Council has granted it, Charles, then nothing you see tonight can take it back. The sealed document arrived at Clarence's house at 7:30 on a grey October evening, carried not by a footman but by the keeper of the Privy Seal himself, and it bore a mark no one in that household had expected to see again so soon. The late Queen's private cipher, countersigned by the Sovereign and ratified by the full Privy Council. What Camilla had not prepared for was not the document's existence. She had known something was coming for weeks. What shattered her was the title written inside it, in language too formal to be mistaken and too final to be appealed. Queen Consort, granted not to her but to Catherine, Princess of Wales. King Charles removed his glasses and did not speak for a very long time. The room fell completely silent. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The document itself was unremarkable to look at. A single sheet of heavy cream paper, folded once, sealed with red wax, and carried inside the red dispatch box that senior ministers use for the most sensitive state business. The dispatch box, for those unfamiliar with the machinery of the British state, was not merely a container. It was a symbol of constitutional authority. Documents that travelled inside it carried the weight of the Crown in Parliament, and what was placed inside was understood to be beyond casual dispute. The secretary who delivered it did not linger. He bowed, withdrew, and left the king alone with his wife and a paper that would redefine both of their lives. Charles read it 3 times. His hand stopped at the second paragraph, where the phrase, "by the advice and consent of the Lords of His Majesty's Most Honourable Privy Council," appeared in black ink. The Privy Council, in plain language, was the ancient body of senior advisers whose formal approval turned a sovereign's private wish into a public instrument of state. Its involvement meant this was no family arrangement, no quiet understanding between a father and a son. It was law-shaped, it had been ratified, it had been, in every sense that mattered, decided. Camilla stood by the window with her back to the room. She did not cry, she did not shout. She simply watched the rain move down the glass and asked very quietly whether the Princess Royal had known. Charles did not answer quickly enough, because Anne had known. She had known for 11 days. That was the first fracture, not the title itself, but the discovery that the family had deliberated, drafted, and decided while the woman most affected had been permitted to smile through a charity luncheon in Bath, entirely unaware that her position was already being dismantled in rooms she was not invited to enter. The silence between Charles and Camilla that evening was more painful than any argument they had ever had, because arguments imply 2 people still fighting for the same thing. This was the silence of a decision already executed. Camilla Desvog's response, when it finally came, was small and devastating. She unfastened the brooch she had worn that afternoon, a diamond piece given to her by Charles on the day of her own investiture of titles years earlier, and placed it on the writing desk between them, as though returning something that had been loaned rather than given. She did not say what it meant. She did not have to. For Camilla, this was not simply about a title. It was about standing. It was about the difference between being the king's wife-in-law and being the king's wife in the institution's heart. Anne's position when she was reached by telephone that night was characteristically without warmth or apology. According to a private recorded account of that call, she said only that the matter had been handled correctly, that the late Queen's intentions had been documented, and that personal feeling had never been a sufficient reason to alter constitutional planning. William, by contrast, was described by those close to him as torn in a way his aunt never was, loyal to the process, but visibly uncomfortable with its timing and its cruelty. And in the background, as so often in the family's gravest moments, stood Catherine. Not triumphant, not even pleased. She reportedly asked her husband only one question that evening, in the quiet of their own rooms, whether anyone had thought about what this would do to his father. But before anyone could answer that question, the family would first have to confront the evening at Windsor that had set all of it in motion. To understand why the late Queen had taken such an extraordinary step, and why her son had now felt bound to execute it, The family would have to confront the private evening at Windsor Castle that had occurred in the final year of Elizabeth's reign. An evening with no aides present, no minutes taken, and only 4 people in the room. The drawing room at Windsor had been chosen deliberately. It was not one of the grand state apartments, but a smaller, panelled room the late Queen used for family matters she wished to keep out of the official record. Present that evening were the Queen herself, the then Prince of Wales, Camilla, and, summoned at short notice and without explanation, the Princess Royal. The fire was lit. The curtains were drawn. What was said there was reconstructed later only from the private recollections of those present, and from a single handwritten memorandum the Queen completed that same night and sealed in her private papers. The triggering moment, by all internal accounts, came from a single sentence of Camilla's. In the course of a conversation about the future shape of the monarchy, she expressed the hope, described by one witness as reasonable, by another as fateful, that when Charles was king, her position as Queen Consort would be full and unqualified in every respect, including precedence over all other women of the blood royal. Precedence, in plain language, was the formal order of rank within the royal family, who walked first, who was bowed to first, whose name appeared first on state documents. It sounded like etiquette. It was in fact power made visible. And precedence over women of the blood royal meant precedence over Anne, over any future Princess Royal, and, crucially, over the wives of the next generation, including the future wife of the Prince of Wales. The late Queen, according to the account Anne later gave her brother, did not react at the time. She listened. She folded her napkin at dinner with her habitual precision. She said nothing of consequence for the rest of the evening. But that night, written in her own hand, she set down a memorandum directing that the arrangements for the next reign should secure the position of the Princess of Wales as the future Queen Consort, in a form not subject to revision by sentiment, and that the instrument giving effect to this should be prepared for ratification by the Privy Council at such time as my son judges the family able to bear it. The word she used, witnesses would later recall, was not desire, it was command. A memorandum of that kind was not a law. It was something more intimate and, within the family, more binding, the recorded will of a sovereign whose authority did not expire with her heartbeat. And it was this document, kept in the custody of the private archives, that had now surfaced as the foundation of the sealed decree. Custody, in this context, meant the formal safekeeping of royal papers by designated trustees, because papers held in proper custody could not be quietly destroyed, only formally opened, which is exactly what had now happened. But before the decree could be absorbed, there would have to be a confrontation, and it came, as such things always did in that family, behind a closed door. The meeting took place 2 days later in a private study at Buckingham Palace. Charles and Anne. No courtiers remained, no officials stood ready. The private secretary was dismissed at the threshold, and the door was shut with the particular softness that in palaces denotes not peace but danger. Anne spoke first, and she did not soften it. You knew this day was in her papers, Charles. We both did. The only failure here is that Camilla learned of it from a dispatch box instead of from her husband. Judge Charles's defense, by the accounts later recorded privately, was not a denial. It was an explanation. He had known of the memorandum since the reading of the late Queen's private papers. He had delayed not out of cowardice, he insisted, but out of love, out of the hope that some middle form could be found, some arrangement in which Camilla could retain her dignity, while the institution honored his mother's command. The words landed like a verdict neither of them wanted to hear. There had never been a middle form. The Privy Council did not deal in middle forms. It was then that Anne revealed the clause no one outside a circle of 4 had ever seen. She produced from her own document case a certified copy of a second page, an addendum, also written in the late Queen's own hand, dated 11 months after the first memorandum. It stated that the designation of the Princess of Wales as future Queen Consort was not a demotion of my son's wife, whom I esteem, but a protection of the succession, which must never be asked to compete with a marriage, however devoted. Anne let her brother read it twice. Then she said the sentence that ended the meeting. The crown could not survive if every generation mistook affection for entitlement. The room fell completely silent. And Charles, who had spent a lifetime waiting for a crown and a lifetime fighting for a wife, now discovered that the two devotions had been placed in opposition by the one person he could never argue with. A mother speaking from beyond the grave. Yet the greater shock lay not in what the late Queen had written, but in what her grandson would now be asked to do about it. For William, the document arrived with a covering note in his father's hand. As Prince of Wales, his formal acknowledgement was required. Not legally necessary, but institutionally essential, because a designation of his wife as future Queen Consort that lacked his countersignature would carry a wound at its centre for the rest of his life. He was being asked to sign. Catherine watched him read it. She did not advise. She waited until he had read it once, then twice, and then she asked the one quiet question that would define the moment. "Are you deciding as a son or as an heir?" William did not answer at once. The distinction she had drawn was the oldest distinction in that family's long education. A son protects his father's happiness, while an heir protects the institution his father will one day hand to him. To sign was to wound his stepmother and perhaps his father. To refuse was to set himself against his grandmother's written command and against the settled machinery of the state, and to begin his future reign with the precedent that a Prince of Wales could set aside a ratified instrument of the Privy Council because his heart objected. Precedent, in plain terms, was the accumulated weight of past decisions that constrained future ones, because in a monarchy without a single written constitution, what had been done before was, in effect, the law of what could be done again. William understood, as his grandmother had understood, that the reign he would one day inherit would be built out of decisions exactly like this one, painful, personal, and permanent. He hesitated for a long time. Then, according to the private account, he took up the pen and put it down again. He would not sign that night. He told Catherine that a signature given in haste would be read as ambition, and a refusal given in haste would be read as a defiance. He would give his answer, he said to his father's face. But before he could do so, the machinery of the decree had already begun to move. And it moved, as state machinery always does, without waiting for anyone's heart to catch up. The consequences were material before they were emotional, and they unfolded with bureaucratic calm. At Buckingham Palace, the Lord Chamberlain's office quietly revised the draft table of precedents for the coming state season, moving the Princess of Wales's name to a position immediately following the sovereign, a line above where the King's wife had expected to stand for the rest of her public life. At Windsor Castle, staff were observed moving through the private corridor adjoining the Queen's apartments with inventories, recording which furnishings belonged to the Crown collection and which to the family personally, because what belonged to the Crown would soon be administered in a different name. At Sandringham, the Christmas guest arrangements, provisionally drawn in August, were recalled and redrafted. At Balmoral, where the late Queen's memory hung heaviest over every corridor, the estate's standing orders were amended to reflect the new custodial hierarchy, and the words "be command of Her late Majesty" appeared for the first time in a document concerning the living. The single most visible broken protocol concerned the private audience. The private audience, the standing right of the Queen Consort to attend the sovereign's regular meetings with ministers and officials, or to receive senior figures in her own right, was, under the new instrument, to be exercised exclusively by the designated future Queen Consort in matters touching the succession. In plain language, doors that had been open to Camilla were now reserved for Catherine. Controlled access, as the household termed it, meant that entry to the sovereign's working rooms was no longer a matter of marriage but of designation. Lists were redrawn, keys were reallocated. One senior member of Camilla's personal staff was quietly reassigned. Camilla bore all of it in silence. She did not cry. She did not shout. But those who saw her in those days described a woman performing dignity the way a soldier performs drill, correctly, exhaustingly, and at cost. Not because her title had changed, because trust had. Her husband had known and had not told her. Her family had decided and had not warned her. The silence around her was more painful than any headline could be. And so it was Camilla who asked for the final private conversation. She did not ask to meet at Buckingham Palace or at Windsor. She asked for Clarence House, the modest, garden-facing house that had been their home before the Crown, the one address in their shared life that had never belonged to the institution. Charles came alone in the early evening and was shown into the small drawing room where, years before, they had planned a future that had no place in it for memorandums written by other people. The conversation, reconstructed from private accounts, was raw and controlled. There were no tears. Camilla said that she had accepted, long ago, that love within that family was always conducted in the presence of a third party, the crown itself, but that she had never expected the third party to be her predecessor, still governing from a sealed archive. Charles, before she could answer her own bitterness further, did the thing he had perhaps needed to do since October. He apologized. Not for the decree, which he could not undo, but for the delay, the concealment. The 11 days of silence in which she had been the only person in the family who did not know what she was about to lose. What transformed the evening, however, was the document Camilla had prepared. It was not a protest. It was an acceptance, written in her own hand. A short, formal statement acknowledging the designation of the Princess of Wales, waiving any objection, and adding one clause of her own, that the record should note she had given her consent freely, and not as a woman defeated, but as the king's wife in the service of his peace. A renunciation, in its true sense, was not a defeat but a deliberate act of relinquishment, because a right surrendered by choice carried a dignity that a right taken away never could. Charles read it twice, and those who later saw him that week said the signature he placed beneath her statement was the act of a husband before it was the act of a king. Yet the greater shock still lay ahead, because no document in that family ever remained private for long. The leak came, as leaks in that world always came, through no single identifiable hand. A phrase glimpsed on a redrafted court circular, a reassigned member of staff, an altered seating plan, until the story assembled itself in the public domain with the speed of weather. The palace responded with a carefully worded statement confirming that arrangements touching the future of the crown have been settled in accordance with the wishes of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth, declining all further comment. Broadcasters interrupted normal programming before the evening news. By nightfall, a crowd had gathered out the gates of Buckingham Palace, as crowds always did when the family became visible in its humanity. One tutor framed the moment with a headline that would outlive the week. The door closes on Camilla's inner palace power. Another, more sympathetic, spoke of the Queen's last barrier. And then came the detail that broadcasters repeated until it became, in the phrase of one presenter, the defining symbol of the public reaction. A handwritten sign had been left against the railings in plain block letters, and it read simply, "She gave her consent freely. Remember that." Whether it had been written by a stranger moved by the story or by someone closer to its heart, no one ever established. But it captured something the palace's own statement had not. That the public had understood, perhaps before the family did, that Camilla's acceptance was not the end of her dignity, but the proof of it. But before the matter could rest, one final meeting remained, the reckoning the family owed itself. It took place at Windsor, in the same panel drawing room where the original wound had been inflicted, though none of them remarked on the choice of room. Charles, Anne, William, Camilla. No advisors, no officials. The door was closed, and, for the first time in that long autumn, the four people at the center of the storm faced one another without the protection of intermediaries. Charles spoke first, and by every private account, he spoke as a man who had finally stopped defending himself. He admitted fault, for the delay, for the silence, for allowing the machinery of state to deliver to his wife what should have been delivered by her husband's own voice. He thanked Anne, formally and without warmth but without resentment, for having guarded their mother's intentions when he had lacked the resolve to do so himself. And he apologized to Camilla in front of the two people whose opinion she most feared, in language that was not constitutional at all. William then performed the gesture that closed the matter. He took his unsigned acknowledgement from its folder, and in front of them all he signed it. Not in haste, not in ambition, but as an heir accepting the burden his grandmother had laid down, and his wife would one day carry. He said nothing as he did it. The signature was the speech. Camilla accepted the outcome with the restraint she had worn like armor for weeks. She said only that the family had survived worse, and that she intended to ensure it survived this. She did not cry. She did not shout. She folded her copy of the instrument, placed it in her bag, and asked whether anyone would care for tea. And so the monarchy emerged from its private winter, bruised but steadier, as it had so many times before. What the family had learned, at cost, was the oldest lesson of that ancient institution: that power could protect love, but it could not make every private wish legitimate. The crown could stand beside a marriage. It could shelter it, dignify it, even sanctify it, but it could not be commanded by it, because the moment affection stood above succession, the succession itself, the fragile, unbroken thread on which everything else depended, would begin to unravel. Love may stand beside the crown, it cannot stand above it. Catherine, the quiet centre of the storm, had never sought the title that now awaited her. Perhaps that was why the late Queen had chosen her, and Camilla, who had lost a designation but kept something harder to take. Her standing, her marriage, and the respect of a watching public had proven in defeat the very qualities the institution claimed to honour. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.